2.5 hours.
James Monroe is one of the most improper and incompetent that could be selected for president. Naturally dull and stupid, he is extremely illiterate, indecisive to a degree that would be incredible to one who did not know him. Aaron Burr, 1815.
Turn his soul wrong side outwards, and there is not a speck on it. Thomas Jefferson, 1787.
Though not brilliant, few men were his equals in wisdom, firmness, and devotion to country. He had a wonderful intellectual patience. John Calhoun, 1831.
Virginia's misfortunes may be comprised in one short sentence. Monroe is elected governor. The Richmond Federalist, 1799.
James Monroe led America through a period known as the Era of Good Feelings. During his administration, the nation grew from 19 to 24 states, and the political climate was more tranquil than it had been in the days of Jefferson and Madison. Monroe's demeanor matched the times. Low-key and reserved, he had a warm personality that put people at ease, and colleagues noted a lack of pretension in his manner. He was about 6 feet tall with blue-gray eyes and dark wavy hair that had turned to gray by the time he became president. Some people thought he looked like a young George Washington. Monroe enjoyed horseback riding and hunting and was the first president to ride a steamboat. He was also interested in elegant living. As Minister to France, he cultivated a love for French food, clothes, and furnishings, and brought these tastes to bear on his tenure in office. He grew up in Virginia. As a teenager, he quit his studies at the College of William and Mary to join the Revolutionary War effort. He served at the Battle of Trenton, where General George Washington promoted him to the rank of captain for bravery under fire. In this portrait of Washington crossing the Delaware, Monroe is directly behind him, carrying the American flag. After the war, Monroe studied law under Thomas Jefferson and then served in Virginia state politics before becoming a diplomat abroad. While in France, he helped negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, an 827,000 square mile plot of land acquired from Napoleon for 3 cents an acre. He entered national politics in 1811 as a trusted Secretary of State under James Madison. When Madison fired his Secretary of War during the War of 1812, he selected the militarily experienced Monroe as a successor. But because Monroe was also needed in Washington, he continued with his duties as Secretary of State, thus becoming the only person ever to fill 2 cabinet positions at once. He was the nation's 5th president, serving 2 terms from 1817 to 1825. Daniel Tompkins was his vice president. His first lady was Elizabeth Courtwright Monroe, the beautiful daughter of a British businessman. They had 2 daughters, Eliza and Maria Hester, and a son who died in infancy. The Monroes moved into a gleaming, newly rebuilt President's House in late 1817, 3 years after the British had set it aflame during the War of 1812. To help furnish the bare home, they sold their furniture to the government for a little over $9,000. Taking an interest in the design of the residence, Monroe later ordered the building of a south portico. Because of poor health, Mrs. Monroe limited her activities as First Lady. Her decision not to pay courtesy calls profoundly disappointed a social set accustomed to the lively and vivacious Dolly Madison. During Monroe's first term, angry Washington women stopped attending her Tuesday night receptions altogether. The issue reached such a fever pitch that at one point it was taken up at a cabinet meeting. A weary Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, called the fuss a senseless war of etiquette visiting. At the end of his second term, Monroe returned to Virginia and Oak Hill, a brand new estate based on the designs of his good friend Thomas Jefferson. After the death of his wife in 1830, he moved to New York City to live with his younger daughter. 10 months later, he too died, the 3rd president to die on the 4th of July. He was 73.
Monroe Museum and Memorial Library, located here at 908 Charles Street, as we take a look at the life of the 5th President of the United States, a man who served from 1817 to 1825, and with whom the term Monroe Doctrine Museum and Memorial Library. Daniel Preston, the College of William and Mary. He's the editor of the James Monroe Papers. David Vocal will take a look at the Monroe Museum archives. He's the assistant director and curator here at the museum. And finally, we'll meet the Monroe descendants, Monroe Tyler Gatchell, Richard Gatchell, and Richard Gatchell Jr., all of Baltimore, Maryland. And, as we said, descendants of this man you see there on your screen. Also here in the library is a painting. John Pierce, when you think back on James Monroe, what do you think about the most?
I look at a painting like that and I see his strength, his good humor, his compassion, his intelligence. Those are characteristics that are part of that fascinating man.
Dan Preston, how about you?
All those things, but also a man of great ambition, great drive, tremendous energy, who was very dedicated to whatever he was doing and went wholeheartedly toward whatever goals he had set for himself.
John Pierce, how come or why do we not think of Monroe as a bigger person than we do in history compared to the Jeffersons and the Madisons?
I think it's just a matter of a sort of gradual fade in importance in the popular mind. Monroe, through the mid-19th century, was tremendously favored. In the 1850s, the Congress spent $50,000 to buy the papers of 2 presidents, George Washington and James Monroe. I'm also reminded that Jefferson was little known at the time of the purchase of Monticello to save it. I think that we have a tendency really to forget so much of the lives of most presidents as far as that goes.
And Preston, how much time have you spent with Things Monroe?
We started working on this project in 1989, and we initially had hoped to do a full edition of Monroe's papers. Unfortunately, we were not able to do that. And so I've been working on a catalog of his papers pretty much full-time since about 1994.
What have you got that you put your hands on that you've read?
We have almost ready for completion. I'm down to counting weeks now instead of months. A catalog of approximately 36,000 items of correspondence and papers, letters to and from Monroe, important state documents.
And have you read all those documents?
Most of them, yes. I had a graduate assistant working with me for several years, and she went through a number of them, but pretty much have looked at everything myself, yes.
John Pierce, how did you get involved in this place we're in right now, and how long has it been here?
The museum has been here since 1927, but I haven't. I came to work as a teacher at Mary Washington College in 1982, and in the Department of Historic Preservation was later asked by the president of the college to take over the administration of this. This is owned by Mary Washington College on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I came here in 1989 as director of planning and programs, and in 1993 became director of the museum.
What room are we in?
We are in the gallery room. This is our largest space. And even so, we have to layer exhibits over books, and events like this one are layered over the exhibits. But it is the central core exhibit. It explains a little bit about Monroe for the visitors who come.
Dan Preston, what was the Monroe Doctrine, or what is it, and is it relevant at all today?
The Monroe Doctrine it was initiated by a suggestion by the British Prime Minister that the United States and Great Britain make some sort of joint effort to prevent other European monarchies from assisting Spain in reclaiming its rebellious colonies in the Americas. The Monroe Doctrine took off from that point, and Monroe, instead of simply saying, yes, we will go along with England on this, or no, we will not, made it more of a general policy statement of America's position on the entire hemisphere, saying that the United States had pursued a path entirely different than that taken by the European countries, the European monarchies, and that they really should remain separate spheres, that the United States would not interfere, try to subvert the monarchies of Europe, but at the same time, the European monarchies should not try to establish their systems of governments in the Western Hemisphere. That there really was an incrossable line between the two hemispheres in regards to their social and political organizations.
John Pierce, where did James Monroe live in his life?
Oh my goodness, he lived in a whole lot of places. He was born in Westmoreland County, Virginia, on what's called the Northern Neck, and lived there for the beginning part of his life. He went off to college. You're seeing on screen the place where the house where he was born, Monroe Hall, and it is marked. We hope people will stop and take a look there. There's not a building there.
Where is it?
It's on Route 205, I believe, in Westmoreland County, about 40 miles from Fredericksburg, Virginia.
But not too far away from where George Washington was born, and you see a big house there.
Absolutely.
Why no house for James Monroe?
Well, the house at the birthplace of George Washington is a reproduction, which was built there in the 1930s. That is also the county in which James Madison was born, ancestors of Jefferson and Lincoln. It's quite a little spot in American history.
On the screen is a map. Those of you who have never been to this area, or even if you have been here, you can see Washington, D.C., and 55 miles south is Fredericksburg. And you can go on all the way down to Williamsburg, where there are a number of presidents in that general vicinity, like John Tyler, and also William Henry Harrison was born down there. Richmond and Ashland. What's Ashland? When did he live there?
Ashland is a later name for the place he called Highland, and that was his family home from the late 1790s until 1823. He actually built another house in Loudoun County, Virginia, and that became the family home. And of course, in addition to living in a number of their own properties, the Monroes repeatedly lived in official residences in connection with his work.
Here in this room there are, you tell me what they are. We were going to focus on the one over here, the Revolutionary Vision, 1758 to 1781. You have these all around the room, and I didn't think the last time I was here they weren't here. Are these new?
That's right. These were installed. These were created by students of Mary Washington College last year. They are an introductory exhibit. They give some view of the major periods in Monroe's life and development. The students started off with a working title of The Life and Times of James Monroe, which was a fairly dead title. And by the time they were done, they had created the title One Man's Vision, James Monroe and the Destiny of a Nation.
We're going to take your phone calls very soon. As soon as you join us here, you can see the numbers on the screen. 202-624-1111 for those of you who live in the Eastern and Central time zones. 202-624-1115 if you live in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Daniel Preston, he was Secretary of War and Secretary of State at the same time. That's tantamount to being Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State at the same time. How did that happen? And he's the only man in history to do it.
He was Secretary of State in Madison's cabinet during the War of 1812. Madison went through a couple of different secretaries of war. The war was going very badly, and then in August of 1814, after the British captured Washington, burned the Capitol and the President's house, Madison then asked Monroe to take over the duties of the War Department as well. And I think it was mostly that Madison recognized that Monroe had the energy and the political clout to bring organization back to the War Department that the preceding secretaries had not had.
How did you get involved in this in the first place?
I was pretty much recruited by Carolyn Holmes, who's the director at Ashland Highland. I was down there visiting we were talking about my work in historical editing, and she said, why don't you think about doing some work on James Monroe as well? There was talk at William and Mary about doing an edition of Monroe's papers at about the same time, and it was pretty much, I was on the spot at the time that these discussions were going on, and we just went from there.
Where did you come from originally?
I was living in Washington and had worked on a number of projects up there before moving to Williamsburg.
Hometown?
In Ohio, Hamilton, Ohio, which is a little bit north of Cincinnati.
And John Pierce, your home originally?
Baltimore, Maryland.
Where did you go to college?
Yale. It was my undergraduate college, and then I went to the University of Delaware, the winter tour program in early American culture, which prepares museum rats.
We're talking about James Monroe, and we will for the next couple of hours. We go to Chicago for our first call. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Yeah, my question is regarding James Monroe and his role that he didn't play in the Constitutional Convention, and why he turned to be an anti-federalist during the ratification. I'll hang up and listen to your answer.
Dan Preston.
Monroe was in the Continental Congress just prior to the meeting of the convention. He very much favored a strengthening of the national government and a reorganization. Once the Constitution was, as it was written at Philadelphia, he had a number of reservations about it. Like many Virginians, particularly George Mason, he was concerned about any kind of provisions outlining rights reserved to citizens. The Constitution talked a lot about rights and the duties of the national government, what was reserved to the state governments, but didn't say anything about individual citizens. And like many people, he thought that the Constitution ought to have a section addressing those sorts of rights. And his voting against ratification in the Virginia Ratifying Convention was primarily a protest vote as a means of urging the Congress once it met. I don't think he had any doubt that the Constitution would be ratified, but he hoped by voicing a strong opposition to it that one of the first orders of business would then be proposing a set of amendments, which Congress did, that eventually became the Bill of Rights.
Ocala, Florida. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Good morning, Brian. Question for either one of the gentlemen. I'm a fan of President Monroe, and basically because as a child I learned about the Monroe Doctrine. Could you give the listeners an idea of what you think President Monroe's position would be on our involvement in Bosnia, since he didn't want foreigners getting involved on our continent?
John Pierce?
It seems to me that if you use the Monroe Doctrine as enunciated by Monroe, his position would be stay out. But, of course, the Monroe Doctrine was revised several times in our history, in the Polk administration, in the Theodore Roosevelt administration, and later on. And so the Monroe Doctrine, as understood in the 20th century, would permit involvement abroad.
If you had to pick your favorite document, Dan Preston, of all that you've looked at, I know that's kind of a vague question. Is there something that really excited you when you saw it?
I think what excited me was something that didn't have so much to do with Monroe, but as with his family, and it sort of held out a carrot of something that I would like to find, and that is Monroe's daughter, Eliza, and her husband, George Hay, were building a new house. And Monroe, in a letter to George Hay, said, we looked at the plans, we have some suggestions, but Mrs. Monroe has already written to Eliza about that. Now, I would love to find this letter from Mrs. Monroe to their daughter Eliza, talking about designing a house. I think it would really give a lot of insight into the family, what they thought about the way they conducted their lives. This sort of thing, it's exciting because it offers a view on a part of the Monroes that we really don't know that much about, and it's also exciting because I can't find it.
Gulf Breeze, Florida. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to know what was James Monroe's most important, what did he do that was most important in doing his presidency when he was president?
Thank you. John Pierce.
Well, my gosh, he acquired Florida. He squared off the northwest boundaries with treaties with Russia and Britain. He, of course, announced the Monroe Doctrine. His administration is filled with many other symbolic events. The U.S. flag was codified as it is today in that administration. He also developed an excellent cabinet system. Some historians have suggested that Monroe's cabinet was simply the best cabinet ever.
Name us a couple who are in his cabinet, a couple people.
Dan, you better do
Well,
that
John
one.
Quincy Adams was Secretary of State. John C. Calhoun was his Secretary of War. William H. Crawford was the Secretary of Treasurer. William Wirt was his Attorney General. So
what was his vice president?
His vice president was Daniel Tompkins, who had been the governor of New York during the war and had been a very strong supporter of the war effort in a region where support was not always that strong.
Pineland, Florida. Again, another Florida call. Go ahead, please.
Pineland, Texas.
I'm sorry, my screen said Florida. Good morning.
Well, good morning to you, Brian, and this is for you, Brian. Your map of Virginia is misleading. In Jefferson's day, Monroe's day, the country that is West Virginia now was also Virginia in that day. And
good point.
I was wondering if you could correct that.
Well, that's a great point. Yeah, well, I think we can correct that in the future, although we're about out of Virginia presidents. We've got a couple more to go. But thanks for calling. Thanks for being that aware. Either one of you know exactly what year the boundaries changed?
It was 1863, during the Civil War. The western counties of Virginia basically broke off from Virginia and formed the state of West Virginia.
Winchester, Virginia, next on our call list here. Good morning.
Good morning. I think President Monroe was one of the most fascinating men that I've ever read about. He served this country in more public offices than any other. Can you elaborate on that? And also, I'm very fascinated with the portrait that you keep showing of President Monroe. He was, my grandmother used to work as a tour guide in that very museum, and they say if you walk around the room and look at the picture, it changes expressions. Can you explain, tell me if that's so?
It is absolutely so. The technique of underpainting used by Rembrandt Peale produces an effect so that your eyes follow what seem to be a moving set of eyes and a slightly changing expression. One of our dear guides has said that after all, he's a Virginia gentleman, he's going to keep focused on you. As far as the many jobs that he held, well, you've heard about some of them, there was never a call to service that he said no to.
Give us a couple of the jobs that he had besides Secretary of State, Secretary of War.
He served in the Continental Congress. He was a member of the U.S. Senate, was governor of Virginia, served 2 different times as minister to France, was special envoy to Spain, was minister to Great Britain. After his retirement, he was a member of the Virginia Constitutional Convention, served as a justice of the peace in Loudoun County where he lived. Just a very, very long list of public service.
He was in the City Council of Fredericksburg. He was a trustee of the Fredericksburg Academy. He was a delegate to the Virginia government. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention of Virginia.
Melbourne Beach, Florida, you're next for John Pierce and Dan Preston. Go ahead, please.
This is Vincent Allen, Melbourne Beach, Florida. My ancestor, Alden Partridge, was superintendent of West Point while Monroe was president. And I'm wondering if your gentlemen guests there are familiar with the incident where Partridge was charged with mutiny. He was fired by Monroe for putting all his family on the payroll, and he organized a militia prepared to defend West Point against Monroe's forces. Are any of you familiar with that incident?
Thanks. Dan Preston?
Yeah, one of Monroe's great interests, in one way that he differed a lot from the other Jeffersonians, is that he was very much interested in national defense and in professionalizing the Army and the Navy. And one of his great concerns, particularly in the years immediately after the War of 1812, was the professionalization, the improvement of the military academy at the time that that Major Partridge was the superintendent. And this was not so much a dispute, I think, between Monroe and Partridge as it was a lot of infighting among the officer corps. The Army was reduced after the war. There was a lot of scrambling for who was going to be able to continue in the Army and who was going to be dismissed. And I think there was a lot of bad feeling. There was squabbling among the instructors at the academy. Partridge did not get along with the commander of the Corps of Engineers. So there was just a whole lot of squabbling going on, and in the shakeout, Partridge didn't fare so well.
John Pierce, how many visitors do you get here at the museum every year?
We have about 15,000 visitors a year.
What's it cost?
It costs $4, and there's a group rate, and you also can get a ticket for this and the other museums of Fredericksburg.
We have a camera outside, as you can see right here, looking at the museum. We also have a roving camera moving around throughout the house. What is it you see when you come here?
What you see are a series of exhibits that introduce Monroe, which you referred to earlier, Brian, and then you see moving through the rooms, room vignettes. For instance, you're looking right now at a room representing the Paris drawing room of the Monroes. The Monroes lived in Paris for a total of 6 years, and these are some of the objects which they had at the time.
What was happening in Paris when they lived there?
Well, first they arrived just at the end of the Terror. Robespierre had just been beheaded. They saw the rise of a young officer named Napoleon who took command in the streets. They were there in some troubled times. And then in the second period, of course, they saw the transformation of the government to an imperial one. So those were very interesting times.
San Diego, California, you're next.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you for everything that the C-SPAN does. But I wanted to know what was going on that there were so many negative things said about him at the beginning of this program. You quoted Aaron Burr and several other people that said some really nasty things about him, and I was curious about that.
Thanks. Dan Preston?
I think what we forget when we talk about this generation of American leaders is we tend to think of them as a monolithic group. They're the founding fathers, and we think they all thought alike and they were all friends. Political divisions at the time were very strong. Animosity during the 1790s was probably the worst they were ever in this country. And simply, there were a lot of people who didn't like Monroe, just as there are many people who don't like President Clinton, who didn't like President Bush, who do not like any president. So you can go through the publications and you can find people saying good things about Monroe as president or whatever office he was holding. You can find bad things. It's simply the politics of the day.
John Pierce, if he were here today, what party would he belong to?
Oh, my. I suppose he'd come close to being a Democrat, although he'd be surprised at some of the way that government had grown and expanded. He might found his own party.
Clifton Park, New York, you're next.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Lamb and guests. I'm calling from a segment of your audience you should be aware of. That's the homeschoolers of America.
We are. We just did a program on that.
All right. Well, about Monroe, as I've been reading to keep up with my own students about Monroe, it seems he was educated at home until the age of 12. And I'm wondering just how many of our presidents, Monroe in particular, were set on the path to greatness by their close supervision and homeschooling.
Do you have students there with you this morning?
I have half of my students. One is on another project. But,
how many kids do you teach every day?
Most of our children are fairly young. We have two, one fourth grader, one second grader, and 4 kids younger than that.
And is one of your kids there this morning paying attention to this series?
Yes, actually my daughter Catherine has been enjoying the series, taking notes on many occasions.
Thanks for calling. Who wants to deal with the schooling of James Monroe?
Yeah, he was taught at home in his younger years, as was the custom on Virginia farms and plantations. I think a good example of this, of other presidents, is Thomas Jefferson, who during his early youth lived on a plantation just west of Richmond, which still exists, Tuckahoe, and they in fact have a small building there on the grounds that's identified as the schoolhouse where Jefferson and his Randolph cousins went to school in their early childhood.
One of the reasons we're doing this series is to get folks in the classroom, give them an opportunity to have the presidential material that they can use at no cost to them to help teach the presidents. And we have a C-SPAN in the Classroom organization represented here today on scene by Meg Steele. And we have a telephone number that you can call or a website that you can call up on your computer. The telephone number is 202-626-4858. That's 202-626-4858. You can see the number on the screen. And our website is cspan.org/classroom. cspan.org/classroom. Call us up in Washington. Tell us you're a teacher, and we'll send you out materials that you can use in your classroom or at home if you're a homeschooler. On your screen also now is another one of the displays here in this room we're sitting in at the James Monroe Museum. Shaping Personal Destiny, 1782 to 1793. John Pierce, what was that period in James Monroe's life?
Well, that is the period that began with his election to the Continental Congress, where he had a very major role in the shaping of the Western Territory, that is the old Ohio country, Northwest Territory. And then that period also included his term as a U.S. Senator, and his several of his terms in the state legislature.
When he was a senator elected by the Virginia legislature, where would he have served?
Yes, the government at that point was in Philadelphia, headed on its way to Washington a few years later.
Alexandria, Virginia, you're next. Good morning.
Yes. Could you gentlemen talk about this? I'm not real familiar of the differences between James Madison and James Monroe. I missed Brian's excellent presentation last week. What are the top 2 or 3 things of the Madison administration? What are the top 2 or 3 things of the Monroe administration? We've got a George Washington University. We've got a James Madison University, home of the JMU Dukes. Number 3 lacrosse team in America. Why is there not a James Monroe University? And Brian, keep up the good work.
Thanks. Dan Preston.
Well, John can tell you about there being a James Monroe University. But Monroe and Madison had an on-again, off-again relationship throughout their lives. They were generally friends, close political collaborators, but they were also rivals. They were of similar age, and everyone looked to them as the successors to Jefferson. And it was a question of who would succeed first. And in fact, in the 1808 presidential election, Monroe was a dissident candidate running against Madison for the presidency. It was more of a protest candidacy than a serious challenge, but it was part of this rivalry. Madison was president during the War of 1812, and Monroe served during that time as his Secretary of State and as Secretary of War.
James Monroe University?
Yes. Mary Washington College, which I've referred to before, is currently building a second campus 8 miles away from here, the James Monroe Center for Graduate and Professional Studies. And it, of course, will begin as a center, but could well grow into a college or university.
Mary Washington College is what kind of a school?
It's a state-owned 4-year undergraduate residential school, and it has a particularly interesting undergraduate program in historic preservation, which is the one that I teach in and oversees this place.
How many students?
3,800 students, may rise to 4,000.
Named after?
Named after Mary Washington, the mother of, who else? George Washington.
Englewood, New Jersey, you're next for John Pierce and Dan Preston. Go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for this wonderful series. I've really been learning a lot. I'm interested in knowing what James Monroe's relationship was to slavery. Did he own any slaves, and what was his public position on slavery? Did he write anything about it?
Yes, he certainly owned slaves, and Dan's going to tell you more about his writings.
Yeah, and it's not a 25 or word less answer.
Yes.
It's a very complex issue. The best way to sum up his views on it is he was I would call him very much an emancipationist. That is, he favored some sort of at least statewide program for Virginia and possibly for the nation of the emancipation of the slaves. at his time, what we don't think about is there was a lot of opposition, even as early as the early 1800s, when Monroe was alive, to the emancipation of slaves, to the end of slavery. And it was a very hard fight, and he never really had an opportunity to engage in it to the extent he wanted.
Were the slaves ever freed?
No. Monroe was heavily in debt, even as a young adult, and although he very much regretted owning slaves, there's a wonderful quote about how badly slaves were treated. He felt very bad about it, but and it's hard to explain this without sounding like you're apologizing for it, but it was a very complex issue. He had problems such as he was heavily in debt. His slaves were frequently mortgaged, so he could not have freedom at that point if he wanted. Virginia law forbade the manumission of slaves unless they were sent out of the state and provided for somehow, so it was a very difficult thing.
You mean people in those days borrowed money to buy slaves?
Yeah, I mean, no, not to buy slaves. Slaves were property just as house, land, livestock, and if you wanted to borrow money from a bank, you could put slaves up as collateral. They were property. They were valuable property, and could be used in that manner.
John Pierce.
One further point, I think, needs to be made, and that is he was active in the Colonization Society, and for that reason the capital of Liberia is named Monrovia. It's the only capital of a foreign country named after a president.
What year was Liberia created and the capital named Monrovia?
I believe the actual colony commenced about 1823. Monrovia was founded several years after that.
And what did we as a country have to do with the founding of that country?
Liberia was originally intended as a colony for the repatriation of both free blacks and slaves from the United States. The major impetus behind this was the American Colonization Society, which really had two goals. One was good and one was not so good. One was to encourage the emancipation of slaves by offering some place for the slaves to go once they were free, and by doing this to encourage the elimination of slavery. But at the same time, it was intended for removing blacks from the United States.
Our two guests this morning so far have been Dan Preston, who's the editor of the James Monroe Papers. He's associated with William and Mary College over at Williamsburg. Yep. And John Pierce, who's the director here at the James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library. Our next call is from Mattoon, Illinois. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Lamb. First of all, thank you for C-SPAN, and as an avid presidential historian reader, thank you for this series. I have two questions for our gentlemen. First of all, the People's Almanac number 2 from 20 years ago states that James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton, and Nathaniel Gorham, President of the Continental Congress, wrote to 50-year-old Prince Henry of Prussia, younger brother of Frederick the Great, and invited him to become King of the United States. And I was wondering if that was true or not. And also, leading up to the presidential election of 1824, that controversial election, Monroe was finishing his second term, and I was wondering whether he favored any of the 4 or 5 main candidates and what his effect on that election was. Thank you.
Dan Preston.
As far as Monroe inviting someone to be a monarch of the U.S., I've not heard this. I don't know where the source of this is. It sounds patently false. Monroe was adamantly anti-monarchical, and the idea that he would invite someone to be King of the United States is simply entirely out of character.
Where did the name Fredericksburg come from?
Fredericksburg is named after the Prince of Wales at the time of the creation of this town, as all our streets are named after the royal family.
And what role did Mr. Monroe play in his successor in 1824?
Monroe tried very hard to stay out of that election, since 4 of the 5 members of his cabinet were presidential candidates. In fact, at one point he joked with his Attorney General, William Wirt, that he was the only member of the cabinet not running for president. It was a very, very bitter election. Everyone knew that Monroe was going to be the last member of the revolutionary generation to be president, and that then the next president would come from the generation that came to age during the War of 1812. And there was this mad scramble among all the political leaders. There were probably early in the contest a dozen. I mean, it was similar to a current presidential primary. There were 14, 16 different men who were interested in becoming president.
This home is located right in Fredericksburg. You can get here easily out of Washington, D.C. if you're coming that way. Come down I-95. It's only about 55 miles down. It takes you about an hour to get here, and you turn off at, what, 17, 3A?
Route 3 really is the standard way in.
How far are we from Richmond?
50 miles.
And in this house, we have a camera that's walking around, and we want you to explain what people can see when they come here. I don't know where the camera is right now. If we could show it on the screen, then John Pierce can tell us where we are.
We're in the hallway and about to move into a room which shows a vignette of life at the White House in 1824. Our 6-foot-tall president and his 4'11" wife and their 2 daughters are about to receive you. Those objects, like all the objects you're seeing, actually belong to the Monroes. This is an important setting.
Let me go back and ask you. You said he was 6 feet tall and she was 4'11". How old was she when they married?
She was 17.
And how long did they stay married?
44 years until her death.
And he died how long after she died?
A year. And he had written very touchingly about their 44 years together.
Earlier, we saw that he had a home in Aislinn Highlands, which is over near where Thomas Jefferson's home is, and he also had a home here in town. Where's the home?
The home here in town still exists on Lower Caroline Street. It's privately owned. You're seeing it on screen right now. That's the place to which the 28-year-old man and 18-year-old pregnant bride came, and where the first child was born, Eliza.
And can you see this home, or is it...
No, it's private. The owners have very kindly allowed it to be on tours occasionally, but it is you can see it from the street.
And of the 15,000 people that come here every year, how does that break down? How many of those are school kids, for instance?
A couple of thousand are school kids. Most of our visitors are tourists through the area. We have, of course, a number of scholars. We also have foreign visitors. Monroe had very strong ties to France, and so we get many French visitors.
We have a call coming up next from Lake Charles, Louisiana. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I just wanted to pay a big compliment to Mr. Pierce and his staff on the library and the museum there. There's just a lot of fine work that goes on. I have an 11-year-old son who has been working on a project since November related to children who have lived in the White House of presidents. And the staff there has been just wonderful and receptive to even these young people who are trying to learn more about their the presidential history here in the United States. And I just had to tell you that Mr. David Vocal has been most helpful in giving my son information about Eliza and Mariah, and has shared several interesting stories about them that he had not known from the research he had done. And like I said, I just wanted to pay a big compliment to them because that is just a wonderful library and museum there, and I hope everyone has the opportunity to take advantage of it.
How did your son get interested in all this?
Well, he read a book about written by Catherine Liner about children growing up in the White House, and this was last summer at one of the local bookstores, and he read about it, and one of the presidents who were not mentioned were the children of President Monroe, and he knew that there was a lot of history that went on with the 2 daughters in the White House, and so he decided to contact the library and museum, and he's been corresponding by email and has received several email messages that have been most helpful. And I must add, his project has won the Best in Show out of over 300 or 400 projects here in the regional, and will be going to state now. And we're very proud of him, and a lot of it goes back to the fact that this particular museum and library who he included in his speech has been so helpful.
Tell us his name again, and how old is he?
His name is Zach, Z-A-C-K, Storer, S-T-O-R-E-R, and he is an 11-year-old at Moss Bluff Middle School in Lake Charles, Louisiana.
What's his teacher's name?
Communicating today, but he's at school.
What's his teacher's name?
His teacher's name is Mrs. Fletcher.
Thank you very much. What did we just see on the screen?
You were seeing the horse-drawn carriage ride, which is one of the several ways that visitors to Fredericksburg can pass not only the museum, but see a lot else of the history here.
This says right outside stop number 13. How many stops do they have on this tour, do you know?
Gosh, I think it's about 30, and you can either walk or drive, and you can tour it by yourself with information we can give you or that you can get at our visitor center. You can tour it with a jitney, with the horses, all sorts of ways.
By the way, she referred to the website, and those of you who want to contact this museum, and John Pierce and Dan Preston, the website is www.James Monroe Museum, and that's James Monroe and Museum, the J-M-N-M in caps, at MWC, that's lowercase,
yes.
MWC, Mary Washington College, .edu. And we'll repeat that again in case you want to write it down if you want to contact this museum. It's www.James Monroe Museum, the first letters in caps, at MWC, lowercase, .edu. Next is Auburn, Alabama. Go ahead, please. We'll come back in just a second. Go ahead, Auburn.
I'm calling to make a point. I have relatives in Fredericksburg and visit there frequently, but the slaves that were brought over as slaves. We did not bring them over, and they were slaves when they came. And so they were dumped around. People bought them in the South, and because they desperately needed somebody to take care of the farms. And as a general rule, they were well taken care of. I know my family was a Ball family, and my father talked frequently about anybody who mistreated a slave was just in disgrace. And I don't know why these points aren't brought up. We didn't bring them over here and throw them into slavery.
Dan Preston.
This is a long, drawn-out question that goes way back before Monroe's time. Monroe's bearing on this was, to bring Monroe back into it, is as late as the time of his presidency, there was still a thriving slave trade of Africans being captured in Africa, being brought to North America, South America, the Caribbean. And one of Monroe's, one of the most important things he did as president was to instruct, and this trade was illegal, by the way, he instructed the Navy to begin intercepting ships suspected of carrying slaves, to return any Africans found on these ships to Africa, and in fact went to the extent of signing a treaty with Great Britain that allowed for the United States and Great Britain to stop each other's ships if they were suspected of carrying slaves. So the slave trade was alive and thriving as late as the 1820s, and one of Monroe's major concerns was bringing this trade to an end.
We're in Fredericksburg today for the James Monroe program. On Sunday of this week, we will be in Boston, Massachusetts for the John Quincy Adams program from the Massachusetts Historical Society headquarters. There you can see on your screen a picture of the museum headquarters from outside here at 908 Charles Street in downtown Fredericksburg. We go to Stafford, Virginia next for John Pierce and Dan Preston. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I have three questions. First of all, did Monroe have any property in Stafford? And secondly, when did the efforts at colonization begin? I understood that he and Madison had both been working on finding some kind of an idea to move the slaves out of the United States to Africa as early as the 1790s. And thirdly, are there any known impersonators of James Monroe that they recommend?
Thank you. Impersonators, John Pierce?
We have two people who represent James Monroe in events here. One is Jay Harrison, the husband of our former assistant director, and the other is David Vocal, our present assistant director, and they're both good, sharp impersonators. On the question of Stafford property, Monroe did not own any property in Stafford County, Virginia, but he did have business connections there. He was paid for some of his legal work in tobacco, as of course so much of the currency of Virginia, and in that way he had to ship tobacco from Stafford Wharf.
Dan Pierce, you know anything about the American colonization?
The colonization movement actually originated in Great Britain. The British established what is now Sierra Leone as a refuge for slaves freed from British colonies in the West Indies. And people in the United States were interested in imitating this. And this goes back into, as the caller suggested, into the early 1780s. There were dozens and dozens of plans floated, suggested, presented for different places to establish them, not just in Africa, but perhaps in the Caribbean. There was one suggestion that the United States acquire Puerto Rico or some other large island in the Caribbean for the purpose of establishing a colony for emancipated slaves.
We've referred to Ashland, and when we were at Monticello, we pointed out that just about 15 minutes away by car, you can get to Ashland. You can see it. Ashland and Monticello can see each other. We have some video of that home. How many years did James Monroe live at Ashland?
He actually lived there from 1799 until 1823, but lived there off and on, realizing that he also used his farm in Loudoun County, and of course in that period he held a variety of posts, including the second time as Minister to France, and the presidency, the Secretary of State. You're looking at a statue of Monroe at Ashland Highland, which is a museum owned by the College of William and Mary, open to the public on a daily basis. A wonderful sister institution. We urge you to go there too.
Sacramento, California. Go ahead, please.
Hi. I hate to return to this colonization thing again, but I was wondering if you could just go back to Liberia for just a moment and maybe just give some details. How did that endeavor turn out? What exactly was Monroe's involvement? And were people, in fact, deported or returned? And was it successful or unsuccessful? Thank you.
Thanks. Dan Preston.
Generally, it was unsuccessful. The American colonization, of course, was not very successful at persuading slave owners to release their slaves so that they could be repatriated. For freed slaves, it was all voluntary. So no freed blacks were forced to return to Africa, but the opportunity was given that if they wanted to. Now, most of them didn't want to because their families had lived in the United States and America for generations, and they thought of themselves as Americans, and they really did not want to go.
On the west coast of Africa, yes, they still have a lot of American names there. Do they still spend the American dollar?
I don't know that, but it was not really very successful. There just were not very many American blacks who wanted to repatriate to Africa, so it really was never very much a successful endeavor.
How much of the Monroe papers are located in this house?
The museum has about 700, 800 letters to and from Monroe.
Where's the most of all Monroe papers located?
National Archives. The National Archives in Washington.
Not the library, but the archives.
The National Archives. Since Monroe had such a long career in the national government, I would guess altogether in the records of the Department of State, in the records of the War Department, and just in all the branches of the government that exist, in the records of the Congress, there are probably 25,000 items of letters to and from Monroe there.
John Pierce?
But I do want to point out, Dan, that after all, you have found Monroe items in 170 libraries and archives in this country and throughout the world.
You have those all on the website?
No, we are putting together a catalog, and we're talking to several publishers at this point. We don't have anything firm, but we're anticipating that the catalog will be out in book form.
We're going to meet a gentleman that spends a lot of time with the archives here, David Vocal, in a few moments. He'll be downstairs. We have a camera down there. We'll show you what the operation looks like. John Pierce runs this library, but has help. How many people, by the way, do you have on staff?
We have about a dozen folks. It's a very small outfit. We also have dreams of building a much bigger wing next door. As my friends well know, when they ask me how the museum is, I say, when in doubt, send money.
How much does it cost to operate it a year?
This runs on about $250,000 a year.
Who operates it? Who owns it?
It is owned by the college, Mary Washington College. It is partly funded by the state of Virginia, and partly funded by income we raise, partly funded by things that are contributed to us through a membership organization. We, like most other places, have a Friends of the James Monroe Museum.
Cleveland, Ohio. Go ahead, please.
Oh, good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
And thank you for C-SPAN. I have a question for your guest there, and it is regarding the slaves when they were set free. At the same time, there were no reparations or make-whole remedies mentioned at all in the Constitution. Do you think that this was deliberately done, knowing that they have participated in a slave trade for more than 400 years, and upon the freedom of the slaves, America have refused to educate, glad to imprison, but most of all to disenfranchise and to continue to disenfranchise, making African Americans exile in a country they were forced to build, and blaming them for conditions that they did not create. Where is reparations when we see that the Indians have received treaties that go back to the 1890s? The Jews have suffered a Holocaust by which United States is glad to help them recover. I don't see this in a country that has a creed that has been denied to a specific race of people. Can you please speak to why in the Constitution the slaves were set free with no remedies or make-whole types of policies at all?
Thanks. Dan Preston.
Well, the Constitution doesn't free any slaves, and in fact, the members of the Constitutional Convention tried to pretty much slavery because it was very controversial at the time. On the issue of reparations, this gets a little bit far from Monroe, but at the end of the Civil War, when the Constitution was amended to end slavery, there was talk at that point of some sort of reparation, either through land or primarily through giving land, but it was never done. I think this is a question that the caller would need to raise when Mr. Lamb or some of his colleagues are having a discussion with members of Congress rather than with us.
If you've just joined us, this is the American Presidents series, and we have a website, AmericanPresidents.org. We'll have a chat room tonight at 8 o'clock East Coast time, I believe, with Mr. Pierce over here. Is that correct?
I'm hoping it's going to be with Mr. Preston.
I see.
What?
If at all possible, could they call and use your computer at home with you tonight at 8?
Sure.
Whatever. We will have through AmericanPresidents.org tonight. You'll be able to ask questions about James Monroe, and somebody will be there, an expert. If it's Dan Preston or John Pierce, you'll be able to find out more if you want to, or add your information from your point of view. We always like to hear the stories of people out there that are into the presidents, how you're into it. If you have special collections, let us know about that. Vero Beach, Florida, you're next. Good morning.
Good morning. And as always, thank you for C-SPAN. And Brian, I want to thank you always in particular because of either the excellent penetration or the knowledge you must have of this that allows you to keep these things so vital and interesting. I mean, it's really enjoyable. Thank you much.
Got a lot of help.
Okay, for your guest there, Two questions. First one is, was Monroe a deliberative type of thinker like Washington, or was he a scholarly type like Madison? And the second question I have is, what was the great ire that Aaron Burr seemed to have for him? It seems like it must have generated for something, because his comments about him were far afield from anybody else's observations of him. And thank you again.
Dan Preston.
Well, as far as Burr goes, I think by that time Burr didn't like anybody. He was so alienated and bitter at his own ostracization, particularly by Jefferson and Jefferson's inner circle, that he pretty much lashed out at everyone.
John Pierce, do you have any idea what James Monroe would sound like?
Not really. Of course, he'd sound like a Virginian. He didn't have a particularly strong speaking voice.
Did he speak often?
I don't think he spoke a whole lot. Dan, did he speak a whole lot?
No, and in fact, the caller was asking about his deliberative style. He was indeed a very deliberative man. In fact, he drove some people to the point of distraction with his willingness to make snap decisions, his unwillingness to make snap decisions. He very much wanted to think things over and discuss it with his friends, with his advisors, and take a lot of time in making decisions.
Did he have any scandal in his administration for 8 years, John Pierce?
I don't remember that there was any scandal. There was one slight breath of scandal. In fact, here in the Fredericksburg courthouse, my colleagues who are working on a records project recently gave us a copy of a document when the Justices of the Peace of Loudoun County went to Oak Hill and deposed President Monroe on real estate deals of his friends, the Mercers. And it seems clear that there was no touch of scandal on him in that.
You mentioned Oak Hill, which is located near Leesburg, Virginia, right outside of Washington. Private home now. Was it ever open to the public?
The private owners from time to time open it for special tours. For instance, 2 years ago at Christmas time, the Loudoun Historical Group arranged a tour there. But it has never been open on a regular basis or as a museum.
We have a camera in the portrait gallery. We want you to kind of take us through there and tell us what these portraits are all about. We're here at the James Monroe Museum in Fredericksburg. What are we seeing here?
You're looking straight at another Rembrandt Peale after Peale, who was a son of Charles Willson Peale, had painted the smaller painting you saw earlier.
Are we seeing a glare on the left there?
You are seeing a glare.
It's a light glare.
You are seeing a light glare on the left. Thank you for pointing that out. That's not a Peale problem or a museum problem, but except a light
problem. And we're also
problem.
seeing a glare off to the right over his left shoulder. That's not in the painting. Okay.
Yes, yes. And again, it's a strong, thoughtful, cordial, caring man whom you see there.
Where is this in the museum?
This portrait gallery is beyond the room vignette, which we saw earlier of the White House, and we're currently making some additions to it. It has portraits of virtually all of the family members.
Silhouettes, were they big in those days?
Oh gosh, yes. Charles Willson Peale and his sons, in operating the Peale Museum, operated a silhouette cutting business, and a couple of ours are Peale Museum.
I know from an earlier book notes we learned that Silhouette is the name of a person.
Yes, yes.
Iowa Falls, Iowa. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Oh, hi, Brian.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Mr. Preston. I studied the Constitution a lot and the Declaration of Independence a lot in 1998. And are you saying that after Monroe's presidency that perhaps the battle for our freedoms have been a downhill slope after his term was up?
Dan Preston,
can you elaborate on that, please? I'm not quite sure what you're asking me.
It was an uphill battle for our freedoms that the Monroe and Madison were fighting for. We got the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and that was a battle. and after Monroe. Am I under the impression that it's kind of we've been on a downhill slope?
No, I don't think so. I think roller coaster would be more appropriate description of where there are gains and there are losses. The early period was a formative period, and a lot of these problems are being worked out, but a lot of them have never gone away, and they wax and they wane. So I don't really see anything decreasing or really increasing either. It's pretty much a back and forth, I would think.
By the way, if you've just joined us and you're a teacher and want to join our C-SPAN in the Classroom organization, you can call 202-626-4858. That's 202-626-4858, and we'll sign you up as a teacher in our Cable in the Classroom project, and there is no charge to you. We also have a website. It's cspan.org/classroom. It's on the screen. We'll leave it there for a few moments so you can write it down. We welcome your participation. We'll send you out lesson plans and other material that will help get you through these entire 41 weeks devoted to each of the presidents of the United States. As those of you who have been following this know that there were 41 men who were presidents, although 42 presidencies, because Grover Cleveland had an interrupted term. He was elected and then defeated by Benjamin Harrison, and then came back and defeated him again and continued for another 4 years. On the screen from Fredericksburg, Virginia, the James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library downtown. You can see the C-SPAN school bus there in the background, and we go to Enterprise, Oklahoma for John Pierce and Daniel Preston. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I'm sorry that I'm Choctaw Nation, and I know Indian Nation. We did have a war here. I am also descendants of kings of England. I don't mean nothing to nobody. I'm a very probably poor person. I work hard, but just everybody remember the Trail of Tears, okay?
Okay,
because
thank you.
I've loved and I've hurt. Just
all right, thank you. I think you're having trouble. Did you understand her call about the Trail of Tears?
Yes, which actually came later, but those problems really originated during Monroe's presidency. During his presidency was really when the demand for acquisition of Indian land east of the Mississippi started. And during his presidency, the United States acquired a lot of land and began the process of resettling tribes west of the Mississippi. But again, it was voluntary. Monroe was adamant that there would be no forceful removal, that that would only be through treaty negotiations that these arrangements would be made. And when individual states put pressure on Monroe to use more forceful methods, he very much refused, and his position within the nation was strong enough that he could stand up to these pressures.
Black Diamond, Washington, good morning.
Hi, thank you very much for C-SPAN, Brian. And I would like to know what kind of books President Monroe would like to read. And thank you. Bye-bye.
I know if I push that button, I'm going to get the same question that I want to ask, and it's always fun to do. I was just going to ask you the same thing.
President Monroe liked to read many kinds of books. He read history, he read military history, military science. He read books in many languages.
How many languages could he speak?
How many could he speak? 4?
He could speak French and probably Spanish fairly well. He could read French, Spanish, Italian, Greek, and Latin.
John Pierce, did he write any books?
Yes, he did. He certainly did. He wrote 2 incomplete books. One was a partial autobiography, and the other was a dissertation on his vision for the power of the people, a book called The People, the Sovereign.
Where are the books? Can you read them today?
Yes, sure. They're not both in print at the moment, but most large libraries have copies of them, and we are in the process of negotiating for the republication so that they will be available. And we think they are valuable insights into what Dan referred to as Monroe's deliberative process.
Mayo, South Carolina, go ahead, please.
Yeah,
Yes, Paul Foster. I was wondering a comment regarding the Louisiana Purchase, Monroe's involvement in that, also the purchase of Florida from Spain, and wonder how strong he was in Freemasonry. Some of the earlier presidents were Freemasons, and comment on that. Thank you.
Right outside your museum here is what's called, I guess, the Masonic Cemetery?
That's right.
Who's buried there?
Many people who knew Monroe are buried there. It's probably the oldest Masonic cemetery in the Western Hemisphere.
How important was Freemasonry to James Monroe?
Freemasonry was an important part of Monroe's life. We have here as an object Monroe's Masonic apron, and I happen to be a Mason, and when my brothers have said, why wasn't he buried in his apron, I think the secret may be that when he moved to his daughter's house, he didn't have it. You're seeing right now the gate to the Masonic Cemetery of 1784, one of the historic sites in Fredericksburg, right next to the museum, and in fact the museum helps to operate it. Our guides open and close the gates.
By the way, where did you get that statue in the garden there? How long has that been there?
The statue of Monroe in the garden was a gift from the sculptor. The sculptor was the daughter of Daniel Chester French. He had been the sculptor, as you know, of the Lincoln and the Lincoln Memorial and of the Minuteman. His daughter, Margaret French Cresson, was a great fan of Monroe, as was her husband.
Wrote a biography.
Her husband wrote a biography.
Of Monroe.
And so that was given to the museum in 1947. Wegner Metal Crafters, one of the great metal firms here in Fredericksburg, has just begun casting two new versions, two new copies of that sculpture, one for the new James Monroe campus in Stafford and another for the Mary Washington campus here in Fredericksburg.
Tell us about the Florida Purchase.
The Florida Purchase was something that was very dear to Monroe's heart. For a variety of reasons, the United States was interested in acquiring that little slice of land along the Gulf Coast that's now the coastal areas of Mississippi and Alabama and Florida. And in fact, Monroe, when he was Minister of France in the 1790s, participated tangentially in negotiations trying to acquire it. At that point, he went on a special diplomatic mission to Spain in 1805, unsuccessful, trying to acquire it. And then finally, during his presidency, Spain was finally persuaded to cede this territory to the United States.
Louisiana Purchase, John Pierce?
Louisiana Purchase was a major event in Monroe's life, as in the life of the nation. Thomas Jefferson wanted to solve the problem of getting our trade goods down the Mississippi out through the mouth of the Mississippi.
What part of that is the Louisiana Purchase?
The Louisiana Purchase in the map on your screen is the large central portion there from Louisiana and near Texas on up. It clearly doubled the size of the country, as you can see on looking at the map. Jefferson sent Monroe to purchase New Orleans for $3 million or land near New Orleans for a port for our goods. Monroe joined American Minister Robert Livingston in Paris. They negotiated. Napoleon's minister said, how about the whole shooting match?
John Pierce tells us that 15,000 people visit this place every year and spend $4 when they come here, some group rates. Has that number gone up or down in the last several years?
It's been about steady, as have most of the numbers here in Fredericksburg and in Virginia. A slight increase, a very nice increase after the last time C-SPAN was here, and I'm looking forward to that event this time too.
What days of the week are you not open, or what days of the year?
We are open every day of the year except for 5 holidays: Thanksgiving, December 24, 25, 31, and January 1.
You have docents here that talk people through the place?
We do. We have part of our tour is self-guided, but a great deal of it is guided by very knowledgeable, interesting, wonderful guides.
One of the things that our education department, run by Joanne Wheeler, does every week is line up a teacher or a student from a school that is named after the president we're featuring on this particular program. wherever we are. And this week it's John McMahon, who is on the phone with us this morning from James Monroe High School here in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Good morning, Mr. McMahon.
Good morning.
How are you?
Great, great. I'm enjoying the program very much so far.
Tell us about what you teach your students about James Monroe, and what do you teach when you do teach kids? What's your subject matter?
Well, I'm a special education and social studies teacher, and because I mostly teach special education students, and I teach pretty much exclusively social studies, I'm always searching for ways to connect what we're studying to the real life, to tangential material, and of course, when we study American history, we talk about James Monroe and the Louisiana Purchase. Also, we talk about world history, which is there's a big emphasis on now in Virginia with our standards of learning. You talk about Napoleon, selling Louisiana Purchase, as you talked about earlier.
Is there a portrait anywhere?
James Monroe.
Is there a portrait anywhere in the high school of James Monroe?
We have a couple copies of the Rembrandt Peale painting, and they're actually, it's kind of interesting, they're actually the real paintings. Are two real oil paintings of him, and somebody told me that a Filipino gentleman had painted them back in the 1950s when this school, James Monroe, was opened. This wasn't the first public high school in Fredericksburg. The original one was Fredericksburg High School, which is actually behind you over there, and this was opened as a segregated white high school in the 1950s, and I guess they had those portraits commissioned at that time.
How many students do you have at school now?
We have about 700 students, and we go from grades 8 through 12.
And how much do you think they know, most students know, who James Monroe was?
I wish I could say they knew loads and loads, but they kind of vaguely know. I would say your average student, at least until they get to American history, which is an 11th grade class, they kind of vaguely know that he is he's an American president. Probably the most emphasis on the historical texts that we study are with the Monroe Doctrine. I enjoy teaching geography, and I always like to mention that although a somewhat benighted place these days, that the capital of Liberia is named Monrovia. And I will say, hey, the capitalist country is named after the person our school was named after. And but I think probably we should use that wonderful museum, Mr. Pierce's museum, more often. It looks like it would be a good. I visited it. I think it would be a good resource for local schools to study Monroe. Although you always have to explain the fact, well, he actually only lived here for 3 years. He didn't spend his whole life here. And of course, was born in Westmoreland County. But I guess the only time in his adult life he actually wasn't in government service, he spent in Fredericksburg as a lawyer. Although I guess you probably covered that earlier in the program.
John McMahon of James Monroe High School, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Enjoy the program.
John Pierce.
And come on and see us. Let's develop a program with you and with the C-SPAN educational outreach that goes with this program.
Has there ever been any thought given to having every student in this town at one time in their life, whether it be high school, middle school, or whatever, come by this institution for education?
Yes, and in fact, at various times, nearly that number of students have come here. It happens that for a variety of reasons, budget reasons, the drive to meet the new SOLs, that the schools have had to retrench.
What's SOL?
SOL, standards of learning, and there's a new higher level of standards of learning in Virginia. Schools are having to work very hard, spend extra time to make sure their students get there.
John Pierce runs this museum and memorial library, and Dan Preston is the editor of the James Monroe Papers. They're here on our set in Fredericksburg as we are here for stop number 5, the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe. And we go to Lindale, Texas next for a call. Good morning.
Hi, I just was able to lay my hands on... I'm Charles Lewis, and I've taught history at the college level. I laid my hands on some electoral statistics that might be interesting to people. Monroe was the last president to run against a Federalist. He defeated the man handily, and then when he was running for a second term, he got all but one electoral vote, and that vote was for J.Q. Adams, who got to be president next time around. His terms were called the era of good feeling, and that might be one reason to undergird that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Anything, Dan Preston, you want to comment on that he mentioned?
I don't think so. It was rather interesting. I think the lack of opposition that he had in his reelection in 1820 goes back to what I mentioned before of everyone knowing he was going to be the last president from the revolutionary generation, and anybody who would have challenged him at that point simply waited until the 1824 election.
Whose idea was it to cast the one electoral vote for John Quincy Adams?
The one, I know his name and I can't think of it, he was from New Hampshire, yes. And I have heard a dozen different explanations of why he cast this vote for Adams instead of Monroe, and they're probably all apocryphal.
What about the one you hear the most often, that they wanted George Washington to be the only one that didn't have a vote?
Yeah, you hear that. I've heard that it was a mistake. I heard that he was mad at Monroe for some reason or another. There's different ones that come up.
John Pierce.
I do think that it's worth mentioning where the phrase era of good feelings came about. As Dan has indicated, Monroe was very interested in the defenses of the country. He also wanted to emulate Washington, we believe, in showing himself to the people, and made very extensive travels after his election to the north and eventually to the west and the south as well. When he, and Dan has mentioned before, the terrible political turmoil of the late 18th and early 19th century. When Monroe arrived in Boston, a newspaper reporter said, "Tonight, political enemies who had not spoken in 20 years sat down to dinner together. An era of good feeling has begun."
Our series is being produced by Mark Farkas, who's with us here today, with some help here today by Paul Brown in our programming department. And the administrative part of all this is being co-produced by Marty Dominguez back in Washington. Our bus is here as it goes to most of these sites. Some other information that we have about presidents, that James Monroe is the fourth of 8 presidents to be born in Virginia. The other 7 were George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, Zachary Taylor, and Woodrow Wilson. At the time of his presidency, almost 9 million people lived in the United States. He was one of 11 Episcopalian presidents. How religious was he? Dan Preston?
Moderately so. I believe only nominally Episcopalian. He was really in the deist camp.
Like Thomas Jefferson?
Like Thomas Jefferson. He frequently makes references to Providence, thanking Providence for blessings on the nation, praying to Providence. Early in life, one of the few letters we have from when he was an officer in the Continental Army during the Revolution, he makes reference to several books on religion that he's reading, but he doesn't really express a great deal of religious sentiment.
David Focal, where are you?
I'm in the collection store.
And what do you do here at this museum?
I'm the assistant director and curator of collections.
We're having trouble hearing you. Let me ask you that again so everybody can hear what you just said. You are?
The assistant director and the curator of collections.
What does that mean?
I look after the objects and after the educational outreach that we do here.
Where is the room? I'm still having trouble hearing. I don't know whether our audience is or not. Our producer can tell me whether that's true or not. I'm getting a lot of background noise from the street out there. Let me ask you again, David Focal, what is in that room?
This is where we keep the reserve collection, the things that are not on view to the public at any given time.
What's down there?
We have our archives and library and part of our object collection. So that's further Monroe and Monroe family pieces, as well as collections related to most of the other first families.
What does someone like you do on a day-to-day basis?
In a small museum, it can be anything, but it could be dealing with educational outreach in the way of doing guided tours, collections management, which is caring for the collection long-term, and working with students as well. We have a very active relationship with a local college, and I work on imparting skills on collections management and other museum-related topics to the students.
What can you show us that you have down there?
Well, I pulled a few things that may be of interest, one of which is an early letter from James Monroe's uncle. It's discussing Monroe's upcoming marriage, and it dates to, we believe, January of 1786. And I'll just put it on the stand. This is one of the earlier pieces, and this relates directly to Monroe's time here in Fredericksburg. His uncle, who was located here in Fredericksburg, is suggesting that Monroe consider Fredericksburg to set up his practice, as opposed to going to Richmond or another larger city. And it's probably on the basis of this letter that Monroe did choose to come and settle here.
How do you store these letters?
They're stored in what we call acid-free material, and this is something that's available through any good stationery store. And this is a way that there are neutral materials, there are acids within regular paper, which can migrate and damage. So by using an acid-free material, it prolongs the life of the document.
How long have you been involved in all this?
I've been here almost a year, and then about a decade ago I was a volunteer and a student intern here as well, and one of John Pierce's students from the college. So it's a long association.
Did you graduate from Mary Washington?
I graduated from Mary Washington College in 1991.
What was your subject that you studied?
Historic preservation with a focus in history, museums, and archives.
We're going to be coming back to you, but we go now to Modesto, California. Go ahead, please. You're on the air.
Okay, let me turn my TV down, please. Okay.
Thank you.
Brian, can I ask you to do something in the future? You know, those of us who love books are always watching you, and you're interviewing people as this gentleman here, and so many times they have books on the shelves behind them, and I'm sitting out here dying to know what some of those books are. So keep that in mind, will you?
Sure.
Okay,
Thank
now
you.
I'll get around to asking the questions. A couple of these are really trivia. You've mentioned other people's teeth in this series. How about Monroe's teeth? Let me ask you this. Is someone by the name of James in those days ever called Jim? But here's the real question that I want to know. Did Mr. Monroe have, as his forerunners did sometimes, have a feeling of the legacy that, in other words, was he making copies of every letter that he wrote with the feeling that he wanted, that he was so aware that he was going to become a truly historical figure? Did I put that correctly so that anybody would know what I'm asking?
Yeah, and your questions are outstanding. Thank you very much. First of all, let's start with the books. We have books in this room. Whose are they?
These books are, in a few cases, Monroe's own books. In several hundred cases, they are, we think, the same edition as that owned by Monroe, and other books that are related to Monroe, his lifetime's background. For instance, the tours of the country, which I mentioned before, are represented in this room by 3 books of 1817, 1818, and 1820, recounting that tour.
Teeth.
Teeth. As far as I know, his teeth were fine, his own, and I have no info on teeth. I'll have to say that.
Did you ever see a letter, Dan Preston, of Dear Jim?
A father to a son, to a daughter, or his letters to his nephews, for example, he would address them by name. So he wrote to his nephew, it would be Dear James, his daughter would be Dear Eliza, but in writing to another adult, it was always Dear Sir.
Did he ever sign it, Sincerely Jim?
No, and I don't know that he was ever referred to as Jim. During the War of 1812, some of the political cartoons, political columns criticizing Monroe in the war would refer to him as Jimmy, spell the old English style of spelling it, Jemmy.
Copies of the letters. Did he keep them?
He did, and I think it was more for personal use. He certainly had a historical sense. He started writing an autobiography, so he certainly realized that people would be interested in what he did, and he wanted to present his view of things. Very different than the Adams. The Adams, I think, are sort of the paragon of this idea of having a historical conscience and saving everything and writing down your every thought and saving everything you can for posterity. Monroe never ever went to those extremes.
John Pierce?
And actually, of course, Monroe destroyed the personal correspondence between himself and his wife. There's a record that on the night after her death, he sat by the fireplace burning paper after paper. So we have very little that helps us to fully understand that relationship.
David Focal, what else do you have for us down there?
Right. Sort of chronological order. We have another letter from 1795, and this looks at Monroe's involvement with the Lafayettes. This is the Marquis and Madame de Lafayette. This letter specifically is an official document. This is a copy at the time from the Department of State, dated June 7, 1795, and it discusses the United States giving money to Madame de Lafayette and basically to assist her to remove from France. And this, again, ties into the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Monroe and their involvement with the Marquis and Madame de Lafayette.
Where are you from originally, David?
I'm from Virginia, near Warrenton.
So you're steeped in Virginia history. When you go back to the Lafayette story, let me ask John Pierce. Lafayette is in this room a lot,
yes.
And you also reference over here that in 1824, when James Monroe was president, he hosted him at the White House when he was on his tour to the 24 states in the Union. How close was he to the Marquis, and what was their first, how'd they get to know each other in the beginning?
I think that they had a very warm, lifelong, nearly lifelong friendship. They were both Lafayette was 20, but Monroe was a teenage officer at Valley Forge the winter of 1777-78. After fighting in the Revolution together, they again met when Monroe first went to France, and just been referred to by David, the money that was made available to the imprisoned Lafayettes. Minister and Mrs. Monroe intervened, helped get Madame Lafayette out of prison. She had expected to be beheaded. Her mother had been beheaded. Her sister had been beheaded. And the Lafayettes then remained as great friends. The descendant of the Marquis de Lafayette recently sent us a copy of a letter from Monroe, which he said that Lafayette's daughter had managed to smuggle into Lafayette in prison. Later on, the Lafayettes were essentially ruined financially, and the governments of France kept changing. Monroe led the Congress to give them a grant of money and of lands, and asked him to come back.
St. Louis Obispo, California. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you for this fantastic review of our American history and C-SPAN. My question is, my great-grandfather was granted a land grant in Wisconsin back in the early part of the century, and family history tells me that it was signed by Monroe that time. Could you bring me up to date on how these land grants were handled, and if so, is there a historical record someplace in the library how these land grants were administered, and if they were requested by some person at Wisconsin and then transferred to Washington?
Thanks.
The way the land grants worked was an individual would buy land from one of the regional land offices about the country, whether it was in Wisconsin or Alabama or wherever public land was on sale at the time. And then once the person purchased it, they would receive a certificate signed by the president and the commissioner of the General Land Office stating what they had purchased. It was a form of a title to the property.
Winter Haven, Florida, you're next.
A question I don't think you have ever addressed, and I'd really like an answer to it, because I've always wondered how handicap friendly are these places? How accessible are they? I have a three-wheel electric scooter, and I'm afraid to go. We're going to be up there in a couple of months, but I'm leery about going to these places because I don't want to get there and find out I can't get into them.
Thank you. Good question. And John Pierce.
You can get into most of our exhibit area with your three-wheeler. We're essentially at ground level for all but a small wing, which is just a few inches off the ground. We will assist you in any way that we can to visit and enjoy the entire museum. Several museums in Fredericksburg are like that.
Fair to say this is a small place, though. I mean, as,
Oh, yes,
as
indeed.
museums go, you can't tell it on television. It looks a lot bigger than it is.
Yes, yes.
What would be the area that we're sitting in here? How big is this room?
Oh, it's about 25 by 30 feet.
And the biggest room in the
And
place?
the biggest room. It's a tiny museum.
Baltimore, Maryland, you're next.
Yes, I have a quick comment and two questions. First of all, I want to say thank you for C-SPAN. I really appreciate it very much.
Thanks.
The first comment, I have studied extensively the life of Thomas Jefferson, and I have concluded that he had ample opportunity on many occasions to make a different decision on owning slaves. I'm wondering, first of all, whether or not these historians believe that James Monroe had opportunity to make a different decision. And I also would like to ask why so many historians are reluctant to judge and hold responsible these men who had made a wrong decision on the most important social, political, and moral issue of their time.
Why do you think, caller?
I think they have made a judgment on them, but they have judged them. Maybe slavery wasn't that important to them, or they don't. I don't know. I'd like to know why so many historians are reluctant. I know that black historians are not reluctant, for the most part, to judge these men from making a real bad mistake on the most important social, political issue and moral issue of their time.
Dan Preston?
Well, I'll defend our profession by saying that most historians that I associate with really don't defend Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, others of this era on slavery. They readily admit that these people were slaveholders, that they took advantage of their slaves, that their wealth, their prosperity was based upon slave labor, and there are many, many historians who roundly condemn them for it. As far as choices, yes, there's always another choice. If you're willing to give up everything that you've accumulated, to give up the style of living in which you've become accustomed, then they could have done it. But it would have been at enormous personal sacrifice, and to say they're hypocrites for not doing it, for on the one hand saying slavery is bad, but then not freeing slaves. Yes, to a certain extent they are. You can condemn them for not doing it, but the fact is they didn't do it, and I really don't know anyone who apologizes for them doing it.
Let's kind of, for those who are just tuning in, kind of summarize again James Monroe. He lived what years, John Pierce?
1758 to 1831.
73 years?
Yes, indeed. And
married for how many years?
44 years.
What was his wife like?
His wife was certainly a love affair of his, right from the beginning.
Where did he meet her?
Met her in New York at the Continental Congress in 1786 in New York, which was a fairly small group.
She was how old?
She was 16, I think, at the time that they met.
How old would he have been?
And he was 26.
They had how many children?
They had 3 children, 2 girls who survived, and a son in between who lived only a year and a half.
Children's names, the 2 girls?
Were Eliza, born here in Fredericksburg, and Mariah Hester.
We have some information we want to show you, too, on the screen of what happened during the Monroe administration. Some of this John Pierce talked about and Dan Preston earlier. Mississippi, Illinois, Alabama, Maine, and Missouri entered the Union, and Florida was purchased from Spain in 1819. 1817, you can see the construction of the Erie Canal began. And also on your screen, you can see that Congress adopts familiar stars and stripes designed for the U.S. flag in 1818. And in 1820, first high school opens in Boston. Washington Irving publishes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. We are in Fredericksburg, our 5th stop. You can see some of the material on the walls here in the displays in the James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library. We go to Raleigh, North Carolina. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. You guys are really hard to catch up with. I had difficulty getting the line. However, I have a question and a comment. First of all, I'd like to know how enforceable was the Monroe Doctrine based on the strength of our military status during that particular time? I have a supreme interest in that because I had to do a project when I was in high school. Also, I'd like to make reference to the caller from Auburn, Alabama, who seemed to want to justify slavery by saying that the people that were slaves were incarcerated and brought to America. And I'd like to also speak to our scholar. It seems to be a little disingenuous when you speak of the Trail of Tears and Monroe's defending that position of the United States not taking over the Indian areas. As the President of the United States, if he wanted to stop that, let's face it, that could have been halted and not have had such a massacre along those lines. However, I know a lot of times in the chain of command, what's issued as a decree from the hierarchy, once it gets to the subordinates, meaning the persons in the military who executed that particular endeavor, more than likely took things upon their own hands. But let's be honest about it. That was just a terrible error in American history, and to try to play it off as though Monroe was oblivious to it, I think that's being just slightly disingenuous.
Thanks, caller. Raleigh, North Carolina. Dan Preston.
Well, Monroe certainly was. Let me stop here. The Trail of Tears really had nothing to do with Monroe. The forcible removals of Indians from the eastern United States to the west occurred during the presidencies of Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren. The Trail of Tears occurred 6 years after Monroe had died. The point that I wanted to make, that these issues arose during his presidency, and he did say no to such things as forcible removal at that point. Later presidents did not take the same position on it that he did.
John Pierce, when did the Monroe Doctrine come about? When was it written?
It was part of the what we would call State of the Union message for December the 2nd, 1823.
What were the circumstances of
the circumstances were that there were, of course, a whole group of new republics in Central and South America that we felt some special relationship to them, among other things, because they were emulating our revolution and our search for liberty and for our own existence. And Monroe had been terribly interested in the whole issue of the Spanish colonies that you see depicted in the map that's now on the screen for years. Dan has referred to some of the earlier negotiations with Spain. Monroe here, and a point that Dan has made elsewhere, very specifically made a public presentation of his view that we must protect the hemisphere and keep out of Europe and keep Europe out of here.
How enforceable was it?
Monroe really wasn't interested in enforcing anything at that point. It was not a specific policy statement. It was not saying, if you send ships over here, we will attack. If it had come to that point, possibly the United States would have allied with Great Britain. What Monroe was trying to do in his statement was more to do, it's a theoretical statement about the differences between, what he saw as the differences between the New World and the European nations. That the Western Hemisphere was different and was not a fertile ground for the spread of monarchism.
John Pierce, in a few minutes we're going to meet some descendants of James Monroe. Who are they?
They are two of the Gatchell brothers and one son of one of the Gatchell brothers. They are direct descendants of James and Elizabeth Monroe. They are members of the group of friends and descendants who meet here annually. They are part of the Baltimore group of descendants of Monroe, of whom there are a number.
How involved are the descendants in your whole memorial library here?
Many descendants are very involved with us. We have had many important gifts. For instance, the Gatchell's mother, Elizabeth Gatchell, was present at the dedication of this museum in 1928, and nearly at the end of her life a few years ago gave us one of our most interesting objects, a quilt made by Maria Hester Monroe and laid down when her father came to live with her in New York and never finished.
Go downstairs to David Vocal. Are you there, or David?
Yes, I am.
What else do you have to show us?
Several things, but speaking of this quilt, I have it right behind me, so I will impromptu open it up so we can have a view.
While you're doing that, let me ask you about that room that we're in right there. What is along the wall there in all those boxes?
That is part of our archives. This room was built in the 1960s as a library and archives, and also as a collection store.
Why are things covered up in there?
Dust is one of the main reasons. It's one of the banes of the curator.
What's under those sheets?
So we have more Monroe furniture that's not on view, also boxes, books, and other materials. And basically we keep them dust sheeted to help protect them and their longevity. These blue board boxes are again acid free. And inside of one here we have the quilt that John was just speaking of.
What year was this brought to the museum?
This came in, I believe it was 1991 from the accession. And you can see it's unfinished. You can see the basting stitches.
And who did this?
Maria Hester Monroe Gouverneur, Monroe's youngest daughter.
And where was it kept before you got it?
It stayed in the family and was kept as an heirloom. She was working on this piece, and you can see on the back where it's reversed, you can see the newspaper that she was using as the template for each of these quilt blocks. And upon examination, you can actually find dates, and there are New York newspapers dated from 1828 and 1829. So the family story that she was working on this coverlet, which is really what it was, a very sort of standard practice at the time.
Over against the wall there is a little box that has a little kind of, you lift it up and you can look inside it. What's in there? You know what I'm talking about? Right there behind you.
Right. These are the archival boxes.
I'm talking about that other little box behind you right now. Just turn it all the way around. Back there behind, see right there?
Yes.
We pull that little string up. It looks like a little puppet show thing.
Right.
What is
well,
that?
This is what I was going to show you next. This is Monroe's hat. Again, it's in a specially made box made by Colonial Williamsburg by conservators there. It's a very fragile object, but it was another piece that was kept by the family. And I'll just move it here and place it on the table so you have a better view of it.
How old is that?
We believe it dates from about 1804. It's made of beaver. If you look close, you can see the nap.
Can you actually, they actually wore those back then?
Yes, this is what was called a bicorn hat. We're more familiar in American culture with the tricorn colonial hat, but when you think of Napoleon and his bicorn hat, which he wore shoulder to shoulder, it was more traditional to wear them front to back. And this piece was Monroe's, probably purchased in Paris from one of the many chapeau makers, and it would have been very much a status symbol.
Now, why is it downstairs instead of up under display up here?
It's very fragile, and we're currently working on a conservation textile assessment. And this is one of the pieces that will need to go for remedial conservation to stabilize it so it will last into the next century, and therefore it will be allowed to be viewed.
John Pierce, if you had all the money you could possibly generate to, extend what you've got here, what would you do with it?
First of all, we would like to acquire land next to us and build an extension, enlarge the exhibits, make a really much better library and archive, acquire additional materials to become a basic research center, not just about Monroe, but about the creation and stabilization of the Continental Republic. And of course, David would encourage me to spend a great deal of that money on the conservation of the objects we have, and indeed that's a duty. We are the public trustees for this incredible collection.
And Preston, some of the other information we have here on James Monroe is that he was one of 15 presidents who were Masons. He was one of 15 presidents who served in the United States Senate. He was one of 3 presidents to have served as governor of Virginia, along with Thomas Jefferson and John Tyler. What would have been the importance of being governor of Virginia back then compared to now?
Virginia was one of the leading states at the time, of course, being one of the largest. The governor did not exercise a lot of power. Most of the power rested with the assembly, and in fact, there was a group called the Executive Council, of which the governor was basically the leading member, and he pretty much needed to get their approval for any executive action. It was largely, it was certainly a symbolic position for him, and it placed him in an important political position within the Union.
We're going to meet the descendants in a moment. We first want to take this call from Florida. What's the name of your town?
Chokoloskee.
Where are you located in Florida?
We're about 40-some miles north of, or south of Naples.
What's your comment or question for our guest, please?
Well, my comment is that although I don't agree with slavery in any term, people have to realize that when the Constitution was written up by Thomas Jefferson, that he did have a clause in there about slavery, and that South Carolina made him take it out, or they wouldn't have ratified the Constitution. Thank you.
You agree with that, John Pierce or Dan Preston?
Well, the one thing that the caller said was incorrect was Thomas Jefferson really had nothing to do with writing the Constitution. He was American minister to France at the time, but there was discussion of having provisions, clauses within the Constitution discussing slavery, and they were indeed excluded because there was fear that the representatives from the southern states would not approve of the Constitution if there was some sort of strong statement regarding slavery.
John Pierce, one of the things that has come through in our series, there are people who call in that just, I'll cut through and get to the exact language. They aren't buying the fact that these were great men based on the way they dealt with slaves back then. They felt if they were great men, they would have released them and all that. What do you say to someone who is watching and studying this process about that?
There are huge imperfections in virtually any human being, especially when viewed from the present. We do, as historians, need to try to place their actions in context, as Dan has done on several occasions in this program. We cannot absolve them of what we see as a wrong, and which some of those very leaders saw as a wrong. There are other matters, such as no vote for women, for instance. These men had strong wives, and they knew the value of women as leaders and managers, but it didn't occur to them. Their whole mindset didn't even allow them to imagine of women as voters, for instance, or as office holders. So, A, we have to look at the times. B, we have to look at the individuals, and C, we have to realize that we may still make the judgment that they should have done something which just didn't seem possible.
John Pierce and Dan Preston here inside the James Monroe Museum and Memorial Library in Fredericksburg, Virginia, 55 miles south of Washington, D.C. And a group that has joined us from Baltimore, a group of descendants out in the garden. We want to introduce you to Monroe Tyler Gatchell, Richard Gatchell, and Richard Gatchell Jr. And to do that, we'll start off by asking Monroe Tyler Gatchell, how do you relate to James Monroe?
I feel a definite kinship, no question about it. The name states it, although I'm not called that every day. My middle name is what is used, is Tyler. But we don't think about this every day. This isn't something that is on our mind all the time. We are not, I don't think, what anybody would call historians in that sense. We feel a great deal of responsibility and revere him, no question about it, and we are definitely honored.
Some people say that the statue behind you resembles you, or you resemble the statue. Have you heard that before?
I have heard it. I have been out here on occasion for picture taking on various occasions, and I'm trying to get used to it.
Richard Gatchell, how do you, what's the line of descension, or how do you descend from James Monroe?
We come through Mariah, and we're fourth great-grandchildren. And I was asked several years ago, right here at the museum, by somebody came up and said, does being a descendant of Monroe, has it really changed your life or done something like? And I said, no, indeed. I didn't think it did. But then I thought about that, and I think maybe there was more of an influence by being a descendant than I had initially thought. We don't think about it or concentrate on that, but our mother was named after Mrs. Monroe, Elizabeth Courtright Monroe Emery. It's a mouthful, but that was her name. And she was very much a part of that. She would be 92 today, so when she was younger, the history and the interest in Virginia and their first families was very close to her. And she was the youngest descendant at 15 years old in Richmond, and was given the keys to Richmond during a great parade and honoring of James Monroe. So we've grown up with that, and I think we have a feeling of pride in our history, being a part of it, at the beginning of our country. I think my interest in the community in Baltimore probably stems from that as an influence.
What do you do in Baltimore?
Well, I'd like to tell a little story. I'm in the real estate business. And years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I guess, I was showing a house to somebody who'd moved to Baltimore, and they bought a house that I had for sale. And in the conversation, he made it known that he was a direct descendant of the vice president under James Monroe. And I said, well, that I was a direct descendant of James Monroe. So we got a kick out of that.
Standing next to you is Richard Gatchell Jr., and if my eyes aren't deceiving me, you have a tie on, like your father there, that speaks to what Monroe? How does that fit into the Monroe world?
This is the Monroe Griffin, I believe, which is part of his heritage. I know John could probably cut in on this a lot more, but from what I understand, it has to do with the Clan Monroe in Scotland, which is part of Monroe's heritage in terms of the colors and the griffin. But John, help me out on that if you could, if you want to jump in real quick. But
John Pierce has one on himself.
Yeah, we thought, Richard, that it was a griffin when we made it, but the Clan Monroe chief has assured us that it is an eagle. So we jokingly call it Griff the Griggle, but in fact it's an eagle.
Richard Gatchell Jr., what do you do in Baltimore, and what does this all mean to you?
Well, I'm in the video conferencing and telecommunications industry in Baltimore, and what this means to me is it's a great way to connect to a different era and a different time, and finding out what James Monroe did during his life is just incredible to think that during one man's life you can go from being an adolescent in an organization of 13 disorganized colonies, and by the time he was finished his legacy in his lifetime, there was really a line drawn down the Atlantic saying, Europe, you're on your side, we're on our side, and they'd matured and they were taking their first big steps as a growing superpower or eventual superpower. But to go from that meager beginning to that, I think is very powerful for one person's lifetime.
Monroe Tyler Gatchell, let me ask you this. If you go to the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, where James Monroe is buried, right next to it is the gravesite of John Tyler. And can you explain to us, is there any relationship between your first name Monroe, your middle name Tyler, your last name Gatchell? Is the Monroe Tyler, does it have any connection here with John Tyler?
Years ago, it was believed that that was the case. And there was some research done by some friends and neighbors who looked into it and found that there really isn't. A lot of people try and say that there is, but there isn't. There was another John Tyler up in western Maryland, prominent physician up there, that we are in fact related to.
Let me just tell the audience that in the center there, that video that they were looking at is the James Monroe gravesite, and off to the left, and of course we don't have that shot anymore, but off to the left there's a kind of an obelisk which belongs to John Tyler, and actually down below the hills, the Jefferson Davis gravesite is located. What do they call you, Monroe Tyler Gatchell?
You mean when they're happy, or
yeah? Either way, what name do they use for you?
Tyler, Ty, Gatch. You know, we're all called Gatch by a lot of people.
Now, what do you do for a living?
I'm real estate oriented as well. Some properties that I own and manage. rental apartments.
Now, is that a special tie you have on today?
Well, this is the original Monroe tartan, which I've searched high and low to try and find over the years, and happened to run into it in a little shop in Bermuda a few years ago.
Don't go away. We're going to take a couple calls, and we'll come back to you. Vienna, Virginia, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Monroe was not an intellectual like Jefferson before him, and John Quincy Adams after him. But Monroe's uncle advised him to associate himself with Jefferson, and Monroe was a very good leader. People in the state legislature and in the federal government supported him. The one thing is he was not. He didn't have the money financially like Adams or Jefferson, and when he bought some land in Virginia to make more money, it was not good land, and it ultimately became the campus of the University of Virginia. I am particularly interested in his religion. It was said he was an Episcopalian, but in those days, people were in churches partly because that was the way they handled charity and other things in the community. But your visitor there said that he was, like those before and after him, a deist, and I'd be interested in more information on that.
Daniel Preston.
Well, there's really not too much that we can say about Monroe and his religion because he doesn't, being a deist, he doesn't talk about it a lot. What we get are references in public documents. For instance, in his annual messages to Congress, he'll mention the blessings of Providence on our country, that sort of thing. And that's about the extent of it.
Richard Gatchell Jr., have you ever gotten together with a bunch of Monroe descendants?
For occasions down at the museum, John Pierce has been really very integral in getting the descendants together. It's through his enthusiasm and energy and efforts that we have met every year or two or three, that we have a gathering. I know a couple years ago we ended up at Oak Hill, which was one of Monroe's houses where he lived, I believe, after he was president. And that was just a wonderful gathering of descendants, and it's great to have that, to meet people. It's a nice networking arena to be in, and it's certainly, the credit goes to John Pierce on that.
Richard Gatchell, why do you do this?
What do I do what?
Why do you get together and fuss over the fact that you're a Monroe descendant? What's the motivation from your standpoint?
Pride, I would say, and interest, and an inheritance from our mother, certainly.
And Tyler Gatchell, what is it about James Monroe that you're the most proud of?
Well, there's so many things, because his history is so incredible as to the volume of what he was able to input into the early part of this country. Imagine sitting down, basically, among relatively very few people, and writing up a whole new government, a whole new way of doing things that even hadn't been attempted, I don't think, since Greece. So that's a pretty awesome situation to be involved in.
This may not be a fair question, but of the three of you, which one has spent the most time looking into the history of James Monroe, if you happen to know that among the three of you?
That would be Dick.
Well, I guess I'm the genealogist. But I really learned mostly from what I've heard from family. Incidentally, one earlier point that was mentioned, Mother one time did say that he was referred to in the family as Jimmy. So you can add that to that.
Now, did any
and one other item, James Monroe married Elizabeth Courtright, and her father had been one of the founders of the New York Chamber of Commerce, and apparently Mr. Courtright wasn't so sure that he wanted his daughter to marry this young man from Virginia, Jimmy Monroe, but in fact they did. And their daughter Mariah, who we come from, married her first cousin, and which is a point of interest.
Don't go away. We've got another round of questions I want to ask you, but we've got just about 15 minutes left, and we have a call from Richardson, Texas. Go ahead, Richardson. You're on the air.
Brian, thanks for the University of C-SPAN. Let me say something. You have a presidential face. I think you ought to run for president.
I don't think so.
Anyway.
No. Santa Claus.
I think your guests are great. They have a lot of knowledge. I'd like to say something about the slavery thing real quick. No person born in a slave society, say in George Washington's time, could escape being a slave owner if you lived and were born in that society. It's impossible. No person today thinks or lives like someone who's going to be living 200 years after us. So it's just, I think it's a false thing to criticize some of these founding fathers for living the way people used to live back then. But anyway, I remember reading that George Washington's secretary, Tobias Lear, said one time that the general was reading the newspapers and he came across something about James Monroe. And for some reason, that name, James Monroe, would make George Washington very angry. I don't know why. Don't get me wrong, I like James Monroe, but I wonder if any of the two fellows there could say something about that.
Thanks. Daniel Preston said, uh-oh.
Yes. Monroe and Washington didn't like each other much for reasons that we don't have time to go into here. It mostly had to do with the political divisions of the time. Monroe, being a Jeffersonian, was a strong advocate of alliance with France, and like everybody, they wanted Washington to be on their side, so that when Washington gravitated more toward the pro-British Federalists and toward the Federalist program in general, this pulled Washington into that very heated, angry discussion that was taking place in the 1790s, and they being on different sides, they said a lot of mean things about each other.
The curator here at the James Monroe Museum and Library is David Focal. He's downstairs below us. What else do you have to show us down there, Mr. Focal?
Right. Well, another piece that may be of interest is another piece that has a Fredericksburg connection, and it is one of Mrs. Monroe's shoes from the late 18th century. Let me just go ahead and remove it from its protective box.
By the way, while you're doing that, I want to ask one of the Gatchells outside, do you own anything of James Monroe in your homes, any of you?
Yes, we do.
What do you own?
Brother Dick has some plates, some dinner plates.
A dinner plate, a copy of which is here in the museum, as a matter of fact.
I have also some plates and, of course, portraits and that sort of thing of James Monroe. Our older brother, who regrettably couldn't be here today, has a sewing table. Mariah's sewing table at his house in Lincoln, Massachusetts.
Richard Gatchell Jr., anything in your home?
Nothing. Maybe someday, though.
Not yet.
We're working on it.
Do you look for things when you're out and about?
It's hard to find authenticity in looking for things. To answer your question directly on that, no, I don't. If I come across them, then it's great. But I don't go out and seek Monroe trivia and objects and things like that.
If you've just joined us, the three gentlemen on your screen are named Gatchell. They are from Baltimore. They are direct descendants of James Monroe. And downstairs, David Focal is going to show us something that he just unwrapped. What is it?
Right. This shoe belonged to Mrs. Monroe, but it was a hand-me-down from her mother, Hannah Courtwright. She had predeceased her daughters, and her things were put away. And in the 18th century, there was no stigma to hand-me-down clothes. This shoe is an English shoe, and if you look on the inside, I'll rotate it, you can see the trade label from the shop in London.
What do you think those would have cost?
The interesting thing is whether they were purchased in London at the shop or whether they were imported, because from research that I've done, shoes are one of the most expensive imports, and you can expect a 2/3 markup from the London prices to the New York prices.
Got to go to a call. Bluffton, Indiana. Go ahead, please.
Brian, I have a question that I'd like for you to ask every week if you plan to have descendants on. And that is this, if they're not afraid to answer it. I'd be interested in how they vote today, since political philosophy tends to be passed along through the generations. I'd just be curious how James Monroe's descendants vote today.
Boy, is that a good question. John Pierce said that he would be a Democrat if he was here today. the Gatchel brothers and son outside. You want to tell us how you vote?
We wrote Republican, maybe to some people's chagrin.
Do you think that John Pierce is right? Would James Monroe be a Democrat today?
I don't really know that.
Depends on what kind of Democrat, I suppose. You've got your compassionate ones and the non-compassionate ones. So many different ways to slice it. Very difficult to say, of course.
Before I let you three go, let me ask you the leading question. Is there anything that you wanted to tell us about your descendant while you were here that you haven't gotten to tell yet, or any stories that you might have brought with you?
Well, I was only going to tell the story about the Monroes in Paris, but was that covered?
Go ahead and tell it again.
Well, because it's one of my favorite stories, and that's when Madame Lafayette is in the Bastille, and she's to be beheaded. Her husband's in Austria. And the Monroes, who are of course great friends, are there at the time. And Monroe finds the fanciest carriage in Paris, and where most of those fancy things have been put away and hidden. But his valet is the liveryman, and Mrs. Monroe dresses in her fineries, and they ride through the streets of Paris, which are full of trash and dangerous, and go to the Bastille and knock on the door. And when Madame Lafayette hears that people are coming to see her, she thinks that's her time, that she's going to be taken to be beheaded. But when she finds that it's Mrs. Monroe, they fall into each other's arms and cry and weep and remember the good times. And then when the visit is over, the revolutionaries realize how important the Monroes are to the United States and to the relationship to France, and her life is in fact saved.
Tyler Gatchel, any stories from you?
Oh, that's not the end.
There's
The rest of the story is 50 years later when Lafayette comes back to visit and has his grand tour.
1824.
1824. He visits Oak Hill and brings as a gift a marble mantelpiece, which is today still in the house, as gratitude.
Thank you. Now, Tyler Gatchel, any stories from you?
Well, somebody alluded to it earlier regarding the 100th anniversary of the Monroe Doctrine's publication. There was a grand celebration in Richmond, and our mother, who at the time was about 15 years old, went down to be feted, keys to the city, rather extravagant setup. And I remember her telling us about it as children. Of course, she was impressed by all the goings-on, the dignitaries and what have you. But at that age, at age 15, think in terms, the Wright brothers really had only been an airplane 4 years before she was born. So here she is sitting there in this, I guess, undercover or whatever, and these overflight of all these biplanes came over. And in that period, planes weren't all that accepted. It wasn't necessarily the norm, but she was very impressed by that.
Before we say goodbye to you, if folks want to either do business with you in Baltimore or get in touch with you, what's the real estate company?
Hill and Company.
Are you all together?
We've been, this is my 41st year at Hill and Company, and we're ready for any business.
Tyler Gatchel, are you at the same place?
No, not. As I say, I had a medical company some years ago and sold it, and now just really own and maintain some apartment buildings. Nothing very exciting.
And Richard Gatchel Jr., what's your company's name?
I'm with a company called Galon Communications in Baltimore, and we specialize mostly in video conferencing and telecommunications, business phones, things of that nature.
Gentlemen, thanks a lot for coming from Baltimore.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Monroe descendants out in the garden here at the James Monroe Library and Memorial Museum and Memorial Library. Call from Lake Zurich, Illinois. Go ahead, please.
Hi. It's interesting to see the descendants. I appreciate that. And you're at Fredericksburg. I heard the descendants mention they get together at another place, and I was just at Ash Lawn, close to Monticello, and I'm confused about where all the Monroes were and when.
Okay, good question. Thanks. Let's again, born in Westmoreland County, which is about how far from here toward the Potomac River?
40 miles to the east.
And all that's there is the little obelisks,
right.
No house or anything.
Right.
But there is the Robert E. Lee House, and there is the George Washington House, which is right near there.
Plenty of historic sites there, and actually there is a newly formed group the James Monroe Birthplace Memorial Association, which hopes to have more exhibit there.
On that map, if we can bring it up again, she mentioned Ashlawn. Again, how many years did the Monroes live at Ashlawn, Highland?
They lived there 24 years.
And that's just near Charlottesville. And what's not on the map is Leesburg, which is right up around Washington, D.C., and they keep mentioning Oak Hill. How long did he live in Oak Hill?
He owned Oak Hill the same period of time, 1799 to the end of his life, but he really lived there when they built the new house in the 1820s after the presidency.
This is public here in Fredericksburg. People can come visit almost every day.
Yes.
Ashlawn, Highland, near Charlottesville is public. People can visit almost every day.
Yes.
Oak Hill?
Is private and only visited occasionally when the family with their young children and so on are willing to put up with a special tour.
There is a little item back here on the wall that says he fell off a horse.
Yes.
And it hurt him for the rest of his life. What year did he fall off a horse, and how did it happen?
1828. He just was thrown from a horse as he was riding. He had had one earlier fall that had hurt him, but this was the one after which he never rode again. And for a man who was a Virginian of that period, who grew up on horseback, it must have been somewhat emotionally shattering as well as physically.
Dan Preston, he was broke when he died in New York City. First, what was he doing in New York City? How could you be broke and own all this property?
Well, he went to New York after his wife died. His daughter, Mariah, had married Samuel Gouverneur, who was from New York. She then was living there. His son-in-law, George Hay, who was his daughter's Eliza's husband, died, 2 days before Mrs. Monroe did. So his daughter lost her husband, he lost his wife, both within a matter of days. So Eliza and James went to live with Mariah in New York. Being in debt, Monroe, like others of his generation, had very high standards of living. They spent lots of money. Also, like planters in Virginia, by Monroe's time, farming in Virginia was really on the wane. It was not profitable. It was still a status symbol to be a plantation owner in Virginia, but it simply was not profitable. And he depended on that as his main source of income, and it never turned a profit for him.
David Foucault downstairs, what's the last item you want to show us?
Yes, it's an umbrella that belonged to Monroe at the end of his life. It's one of a pair. We have the other as well. They were given to Monroe and to Lafayette by the citizens of Boston. And before I open it up, I just want to show you this detail shot of the engraving on the handle, which just says James Monroe, President of the United States, 1825. And on the body of the umbrella is a brass embossed saying Lafayette, nation's guest, with a profile portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette. Another piece that is very fragile, but is a rare survival.
Did you build that little box?
It was built by the conservators at Colonial Williamsburg for us, and they've made this very special housing, which I'll slide out.
I don't know that you want to reveal this, but what's something like that cost to have built?
They built it for us at no cost.
Really? What do you think it would cost if somebody wanted that kind of a protective box to be built?
If it was built by a conservator, it would probably cost several $100s. The material alone is rather expensive. You can see the way the lucite has been made to build a cradle for it. It is a silk umbrella. Monroe's is sort of a buff color. It may be an ivory original with green and ochre color. And Lafayette's is green.
Can you not open it? It looks like it's shredded.
Unfortunately, no, it's too shredded. And it's part of our conservation assessment that we'll be building a protective housing for the silk so it will survive as original as possible.
Do you do this here as a curator full-time?
That's correct.
What would you recommend to somebody that wants to get into the work that you're in?
To attend one of the training programs, either here or abroad, in museum studies. If they're interested in conservation, they should contact the Smithsonian, who has a list of some of the conservation schools through the Conservation Analytical Laboratory in Washington, D.C.
What did you study at Mary Washington College?
I studied historic preservation, so it was archaeology, architecture, and history museums.
And if you don't mind me asking, how old are you?
I'm 31. And I did my master's degree in England in museum studies.
Thanks for joining us. John Pierce, you want to say something?
I just wanted to say that David's program abroad was a very important part of his background and training, and there are wonderful programs there as well as here.
And John Pierce, how many years have you run this institution?
I have run this institution since 1993. I was director of planning and programs before that.
You still teach?
I still teach.
What kind of courses?
I now teach basically museum courses. I teach the History Museum. I teach a course in museum work in which the students create an exhibit like the one we're sitting in the middle of. I teach a course in the decorative arts. I have taught most of the courses in the historic preservation major.
Dan Preston, do you still teach?
No, I'm working full-time on Monroe project.
Let's go to one of our last calls for this fifth stop, James Monroe, Fredericksburg, Virginia, to Grand Island, New York. Go ahead, please.
Hello. I'm interested in why so many of those first presidents were from Virginia. I was wondering if slavery was not perhaps one of the most important factors in making it possible for these men to be so talented, to have the leisure to study and communicate and travel and make it possible for them to be president. After all, there must have been very capable people in other parts of the early states also.
Thanks. John Pierce?
To a certain extent, of course, having the slavery to give them some leisure was an important factor, but really much more important in the creation of Virginia leadership was, of all things, tobacco, because tobacco farming had to be done on a very large scale. It led to the early creation of counties, and these men almost always rose as justices of the peace in the county, members of the vestry in the county, House of Burgesses, and produced a large crop. Dan has referred to the size of the colony, a large crop of trained leaders who then went on to have an important role in the nation.
I want to thank Media General Cable Television of Fredericksburg for your assistance in helping us during this stop here. And again, those of you who are teachers and who have joined us, we want to put the website and the telephone number back up on the screen of the cable and the C-SPAN in the Classroom project. You can see it there at 202-626-4858. There is someone at that number at the office right now, or if it's after the live broadcast and if it's on a Friday night or some other time, you can get the voicemail and leave your message and they will get back to you. That's 202-626-4858. cspan.org/classroom is the website, and there is all kinds of material. Also, an AmericanPresidents.org website that you can join us at 8 o'clock on Friday night. On the night that this was originally done live on Monday. And there will be someone there from the museum to answer questions about James Monroe in a chat room. That's AmericanPresidents.org. And we only have just a couple minutes left. Dan Preston, what's going to be the final result of all the research you've done and the 36,000 documents you've read?
What we're going to have initially is a catalog. That is a book that describes the letters, tells where they are located. We're not going to publish any of the letters in this volume. It will simply be a guide to, as John said, we have gathered these from over 180 different libraries around the country and in Great Britain. So it will tell readers what the letters are about, and then if they want to consult the actual letters themselves, where they can find them.
Sunday, again, at 9 o'clock East Coast time, John Quincy Adams at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Final comment from John Pierce. What's the toughest thing about running an organization like this?
Oh, it's always people problems in a museum as well as any other institution. Boards that either differ from you or that you need to bring along. Raising money, always the major problem. We have a bill in Congress to help give us money to create the James Monroe Presidential Center next to the building, and that's going to take a while, take a lot of effort. I think that a museum is an institution, after all, with all the problems and all of the possibilities.
Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us here for the last over 2 hours. Thanks to the Senators for coming down from Baltimore, and David Focal, who is the curator here. And very importantly, thanks to our callers you made this very real, your questions and your comments. And that's it from James Monroe's headquarters here in Fredericksburg, Virginia.